The Marvelous Malala by Hailey Larsen and Jasmine Granfors.
Malala Yousafzai had a huge impact on society. Her impact surely created change and sparked debates about international and specifically America's opposition to the Taliban. Her courageous diplomacy had sparked awareness and change about sexism and horrible living environments in the Middle East, and by extension, throughout the world. Secondly, Malala is an exceptional example of diplomacy. She was never violent in her protests, and she communicated her points successfully and effectively. She used peaceful negotiation techniques to communicate her points and educate others. Malala's story is just one of many girls fighting for an education, and most were silent. It was not only her voice, she represented many others. Her voice was the voice of 66 million girls deprived of education. This is a historical event to be remembered in U.S. history because of the change and impact it had on many people in America. Since her speech, many debates and changes have happened, and many schools in the U.S. teach their students about Malala. Many people in America are inspired by Malala's strive to girls' rights to education and her actions affected by the Taliban. In America, it helps us evaluate equality in our own nation and to be more aware and proactive about educational equality and on an international scale.
Malala started off as a different, intelligent, and outspoken girl. She loved playing with her neighbors, learning in school, and reading books. Although she enjoyed doing things that other girls enjoyed, she did not live a normal life like her peers. For example, her family was already targeted by the Taliban because her dad, Zayed Yousafzai, was the principal of Kushal School in Pakistan, which was a school for high school girls, and women going to school was unacceptable in Malala's society. So, as she grew older and the Taliban grew stronger, she and her family had to be more cautious. As she saw the issues around her firsthand, she started to care more about women's rights. Her diplomacy skills started developing at a young age. She made many speeches, campaigns, and documentaries about women's and children's rights to education to help others understand her plight and the plight of those around her. She repeatedly stated that education was the cure for much of the violence and fear she experienced.
As the Taliban grew, people started to fear it more. The Taliban taught people that women shouldn't have any rights and that women were property. People believed them or obeyed them out of fear because the Taliban would punish non believers, their friends, or family with violence. The Taliban had many rules regarding women. For instance, women could not walk out in front of a man in public or even go out in public if they didn't have a blood relative with them. And they could not hold their heads up too high or walk too loudly because women should remain unseen and unheard. Women not only had to wear the hijab and the niqab when they were in public, but they also had to wear the burqa. A burqa is a long, loose garment that covers your entire body and even covers your eyes with mesh fabric. The Taliban told girls aged 7 to 12 to wear a white or black veil and transition to the burqa at 13. The Taliban forced these rules upon everyone living in the Middle East, and people had no freedom to choose. The men had more rights than women, but they did have some restricting rules. One of these rules is that they had to grow their beards out.
The Taliban was so horrible in their punishment that they would go as far as to kill people that deemed, quote, criminals and hang them on a crane and display the dead people to the public to show them what happens when they disobeyed the rules. The Taliban would also beat, rape, and force marriage upon women, especially those who were labeled disobedient. It is estimated that the Taliban killed 241,000 people just because they didn't follow the rules. The Taliban broke apart families, broke their countries, and left a huge negative impact on the world. Malala Yousafzai was just one of the people targeted, and the Taliban wanted her dead just because she stood up for women's rights and children's rights. This shows how, even in the face of death and extreme adversity, she was brave and still calmly spoke and advocated for girls like her.
On October 9, 2012, Malala was headed home on a bus from school with her friends after taking an exam, but then a young bearded man stepped on the road, which Malala's friend Maniba thought was a reporter wanting to talk to Malala. The man approached the bus and then asked, quote, "Who is Malala?" End quote. Everyone on the bus was silent, but her friend looked at Malala, plus her face was uncovered. Once he figured out who Malala was, he lifted a black pistol and fired 3 bullets. One bullet hit Malala and grazed her left eye, skull, and brain, which caused her eardrum to shatter and her jaw joints to break. The other 2 bullets were fired hit 2 of Malala's friends, Shazia Ramazan and Kainat Riaz.
Malala took a horrible experience, and its painful aftermath was able to make her diplomacy and her voice even stronger and more well known to the world, inspiring awareness in the United States and beyond. Although she did have long lasting physical and emotional scars from the shooting, once Malala was shot, the whole world knew about the shooting and her strife for women's and children's rights because she continued to speak up. While she was in the hospital with a swollen brain, blurred vision, a face swollen the size of a melon with large bruises and stitch marks across her face, people across the world were sending her get well letters. She had a larger audience and platform to advocate for educational equality and women's rights. The shooting of Malala sparked a worldwide tribute to her, and everyone was inspired by her. However, it is important to remember that although she was getting lots of love from the world, she was physically suffering. After the attack, she had an emergency surgery in Peshawar where they removed her left temporal skull bone to create space for her brain to swell. On October 15, 2013, she was flown from Peshawar to Birmingham, England for better health care. It was an 8-hour flight, and the doctors had to fight for Malala's life the whole way, one breath at a time.
Once she was awake and conscious, she was just grateful to be alive. Because she had a tube in her mouth, she could not speak, so she had to write things down for the nurses to know what she was saying. She had a very hard time writing things down, though, due to her brain damage, which made writing very frustrating for Malala. But she did not give up. She recalls that she had many questions when she woke up from her 3-day coma, but the first question she asked was, quote, "Why have I no father?" End quote. Malala was very worried about her father because he was also largely targeted by the Taliban. Thankfully, her father was okay, but he was in hiding due to the Taliban hunting him.
After the tube in Malala's throat was removed, she finally was able to talk, so she had another call with her father. Zahidin told Malala that he would be there by her side in 2 days, but the 2 days became 4 days. 4 days later, Dr. Javid told Malala that her parents were coming. She was overjoyed to see her family.
Because of her suffering, she had said she had cried more than she had ever cried before, but this suffering seemed to fuel her determination to speak for those who were still suffering. Malala was, quote, shocked at how old and tired, end quote, her parents had looked because of how they were emotionally and physically exhausted from the long hours of traveling and all the worrying they did for their daughter. They all paid a great price for her decision to stand up for what was right.
Throughout her life, both in Pakistan and when she was in other places, Malala believed that the education for girls was important, and she repeatedly made her views known, even though the Taliban thought otherwise. The Taliban thought that women should never get an education because there's no need for it. The Taliban destroyed school buildings and killed hundreds of teachers and students, and specifically terrorized girls seeking an education. Malala was in a unique position because she had first-hand experience of this and could speak from a place of personal pain. Malala despised unequal educational rights and thought it was not right, so she proceeded to speak out publicly against the prohibition of the education of girls. She didn't give up before or after the shooting. She kept advocating, and she stayed strong, peaceful, and firm.
It is important to realize that Malala Yousafzai started making speeches for girls and women's education at the tender age of 11, long before she was well known as a victim. On September 1st, 2008, Malala's father took her to a local press club in Peshawar to protest against school closings. Her first speech states, quote, "How dare the Taliban take away my basic rights to education," end quote. Later in 2008, the TTP announced that all girls' schools in Swat would be shut down on January 15th, 2009. While the TTP shut down all girls' schools in Swat, the Taliban also blew up more than 100 of them. Because of this, Malala also made many other speeches. For example, quote, "I speak for all the girls and boys," end quote, and quote, "Power of education frightens extremists," end quote. These are all speeches made by Malala to protest against the Taliban's controlling judgments. She kept persevering even though it put her family and herself in danger.
On July 12, 2013, her 16th birthday, the United Nations declared that day International Malala Day. That day, Malala made a speech about the Taliban attacks in the Middle East against school teachers and her classmates. Although she wanted everyone to get a proper education, she mainly focused on women's rights and girls' education because they are, quote, suffering the most, end quote. She said, quote, "We cannot succeed when half of us are held back," end quote. Malala made this speech to continue her fight for those who can't fight for themselves. She believed that education was the key to breaking the fear and violence cycles she witnessed.
As a result of Malala's brave protests, Malala ended up being the youngest person to get a Nobel Prize at the age of 17 in 2014. She got a Nobel Peace Prize because she was struggling against the suppression of children and young people and for the right of all children to receive an education. In July 2015, with support from the Malala Fund, Malala opened a girls' school in Lebanon for refugees from the Syrian war. After winning the Nobel Prize, she continued to attend school in England and she graduated from the University of Oxford in 2020.
Overall, Malala has inspired us all, and she stands as one of our biggest role models. She's changed the world, changed our perspectives, and is an excellent example of diplomacy. Her strong, nonviolent words sparked important debates in many nations, including the United States, about how to advocate on a world and national level for equal rights. This has changed how our nation views its international responsibilities and will throughout history. She was so humble and peaceful with her protests, and she made the world a better place. Malala Yousafzai is an example of strength, diplomacy, and courage.